What's up, theology nerds? This is Trip. Before we jump into the podcast, I just want to tell you a secret that indeed the internet is correct. The secrets are true. And if you want to know what the secrets are, that's right. Secrets about what Peter Rollins and I are going to do together this summer in flyover country. Then you want to text Beer Me Jesus, no spaces, to 44222. That's Beer Me Jesus to 44222. And you will be on the email list of all the people that will get the secrets sent to them right into their email box. Plus, make sure you check out the Homebrewed Facebook page, because Pete and I are going to be doing some Facebook Lives at the beginning of March to share some details and, honestly, just to answer some questions, catch up, and play around on the internet. All right, see you there. Peace. What's up, theology nerds? This is Trip. Before we jump into the podcast, I just want to tell you a secret that indeed the internet is correct. The secrets are true. And if you want to know what the secrets are, that's right. Secrets about what Peter Rollins and I are going to do together this summer in flyover country. Then you want to text Beer Me Jesus, no spaces, to 44222. That's Beer Me Jesus to 44222. And you will be on the email list of all the people that will get the secrets sent to them right into their email box. Plus, make sure you check out the Homebrewed Facebook page, because Pete and I are going to be doing some Facebook Lives at the beginning of March to share some details and, honestly, just to answer some questions, catch up, and play around on the internet. All right, see you there. Peace.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Go Kierkegaard webinar. And this is where we're going to come up with some really good reasons. Well, not coming up with them. We're sharing them to go to sing with Soren theologically. And I'm excited because, like, Stephen and I are now like 30-minute friends, and I feel like it's the beginning of a wonderful friendship.
I'm gonna get some beard oil tips from you, I think.
Ooh, I have a collection. My wife makes beard oil.
Really?
So yeah.
Oh, okay.
If you do this correctly, you could go home with some beard oil. And my beard oil, cologne, and soap all smell the same.
Okay.
And they didn't have whatever you put in those things to avoid cancer. It doesn't have it.
And it smells fine. It smells good.
Well, it smells better than the dead animal in my ceiling.
Right.
Anyway, so first off, before you talk anything about Kierkegaard, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the amazing book that everyone's probably already purchased but are waiting to get for their friends till after this is done.
Right. You want to hear about myself or the book?
But who you are and then how you get to writing a book.
Who I am, I'm Stephen Backhouse, but this I've probably always explained. I always have to explain my accent when I talk. So my accent is, this is what you sound like if you're a Canadian who moved to England when he was 19 and then lived his whole adult life in Britain. That's what you sound like this. And I married an English woman, and now we live in just 2 months into living in California. So my accent is a mess, a complete mess. So there you go.
And how did you become a theological ethicist?
Well, my move to England was part of it, actually. So I grew up in real kind of Bible Belt Canada. You might be surprised to hear we have one.
Oh.
We have a Bible Belt Canada.
I mean, I grew up in the South. We don't even believe they read the Bible once you cross the Mississippi.
All socialists up there, of course. Yeah, so I grew up in quite conservative. I mean, good people. And I moved to the UK, and all of a sudden I discovered, wow, this Christianity is a lot deeper and wider than what I expected. You know, perhaps my little group didn't invent Christianity. It started making me really think about my connection between my national identity and my Christianity. So I'd very much associated my culture, certain sort of conservative culture, with Christianity. So I really started thinking about that when I moved to a whole new world, and I discovered Kierkegaard. I was working in a bookshop. I was just paying my way around the country, working in a bookshop, and I was using my employee discount to work my way through the top 10 world classics kind of thing. Discovered Fear and Trembling.
Oh, undid
my world. Sort of, it was like Vertigo. I was reading it. Have you ever read it?
Oh yeah.
And it just kind of, I almost felt the bottom of my world drop out. It was a brilliant experience, and sort of undoes your idea. What Fear and Trembling does, Kierkegaard, he really draws a line between sociality and social morality and faith and Christianity. So all of a sudden he was helping me articulate something that I was growing to suspect anyway. And then I hadn't started university yet, but because I loved Kierkegaard so much, when I decided to go to university in England, I kept choosing options that would let me study him more. So I chose to study philosophy and theology at university, and then I did my master's in Kierkegaard, and then I've done my doctorate in Kierkegaard, and now I'm writing this book. Well, I've written a couple books on Kierkegaard, but one of them is a very expensive academic book, and this one is not.
and in this one, as someone who loves Kierkegaard and wanting to share Kierkegaard, unless you got enough existential angst to sit with what he's going to do in his normal book, how do you introduce him? And I think your book's great because it tells his whole life story. And by the time you get done, you're like, he's a conflicted and contested person who's trying to figure out faith and all the different things he does that you think are crazy and awesome. He does it with this intense passion. Yeah. That's part of what's so perplexing about it. And I also will regularly just read stuff philosophers write, but never know that much, all the details about his life and the family. And I mean, I knew the story of Regina, but not how you tell it. And I just thought to myself, I hope HBO's reads your book and makes
a good movie
or a miniseries.
It would.
Yeah.
It would. I mean, there's a lot of stuff us pointy-headed academics know about Kierkegaard's life, but normal people don't. And I tell the story in my introduction that I had a colleague who is a theologian, really brilliant theology professor, a priest in the established Church of England and all this kind of stuff. And he asked me, do you have anything on Kierkegaard that I could read? And I gave him what I had on the shelf, some biography. And he couldn't even get through the first chapter. He thought it was really boring and dull. And I just thought, this is a problem because this guy, Kierkegaard, not only is his life itself really exciting, but he has given us a lot of the words and the concepts we use to even discuss modern Christianity. I mean, we're all Kierkegaardian influence, whether you know it or not. So I just thought, I need to find a way to get this story out. So I just thought, there's nothing on my bookshelf that will do it, so I got to do it myself. Well, so there you are.
There.
I hope it works.
Well, I really enjoyed it. And the other perk about the book for people that are trying to decide, they may have tried Fear and Trembling once and got 10 pages in and said no. Yeah. Is you have the asides or whatever you call them, the summaries about the books he's writing. And if you get the book or the audiobook, which is done really well. Yeah. You can hear the whole,
not my accent.
If your accent, that might have doubled the listenership. But you kind of bracket off the summaries of the content of the different works. Yeah. And so if you're reading through his life and aren't familiar with it at all, when it gets to, when it says, philosophical fragments, and you're like, what? Yeah. Then you can read the summary of the book and the big ideas, and fill it in. Or if you just want to pay attention to his life, you can. So I mean,
your listeners might be aware that there already are a couple of really big, fat biographies, 600-page, 700-page biographies out there, and they're intellectual biographies. So they kind of really pay attention to. They go into huge detail about what was Soren thinking at the time, or what was going into his writing, and they kind of weave together his life and his intellectual development. And I thought, well, the world doesn't need another one of those because we've got two really good ones. Mm-hmm. But something that maybe will separate out the interesting bits of his life, but also provide a handy overview to each of his works. And I very deliberately kept them separate so that you could, as you said, you can read the one and not the other if that's what interests you. So, yeah. That's
so I guess if someone was like in a master's program and had to write like a qualifying exam on Kierkegaard and wanted just not to read him, you could just read the short parts.
Cliff's notes. Cole's notes.
Yeah. But if you do that, you have to buy 2 copies of the book because he doesn't want to be responsible for you not engaging Kierkegaard.
And as I say, even in the book, Kierkegaard hated people who provided summaries. He even wrote deliberately to avoid summarization. So he hates me very much right now.
Well, I think he should also love you. And, but that's not necessarily a blessing if Kierkegaard loves you. That could just, pack your life full of, lots of pain.
He's a great guy.
So, before we jump into Kierkegaard's like a thought and why someone would want to take him seriously, what were what are some of the highlights in his biography that make him fascinating as a human, on top of like, I mean, if you don't know, like, I mean, Kierkegaard is like the founder of existentialism, the founder of really Western's critique of Christendom, Western philosophical critiques of Christendom. He is one of the best advocates for the subjective nature of faith. It's the best critique of just religion as ethics. And his articulation of the incarnation is like, at some point I want to teach a seminar that's like Anselm, Athanasius, and Kierkegaard, because all three of them, in very different historical, political situations, wrestle with the incarnation, either to engage their society, disengage it, critique it. And all three of them uniquely see the incarnation as like the focal point for thinking Christologically than just the cross or that kind of thing. But nonetheless,
we're totally going to talk about that.
That was a long question just to say some cool things about his life.
Well, I mean, that we're going to talk about that, his thought for the next, that's what this is going to be. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. I mean, in his life, I mean, he grew up in, I mean, let's get the dates. He died in 1855 in Copenhagen in Denmark. He was 42 years old. So he wasn't, he didn't have a long and fruitful life, as it were. He has his writing career is only about 14 years. And in that time, he wrote about 24 books, as well as reams of journals and newspaper articles and things. So he was an obsessive compulsive writer, I think. He would spend a lot of his time walking in the day, and then at night he would stay up and he would stand at his desk and he would write all night. And he had a hunchback, so he had to stand when he wrote, but that's why he walked as well, to keep himself, to avoid pain. He loved people, and he would go for these walks around Copenhagen, and he'd call them his walk thinks. He'd think, his people bath, he'd call it. And he would
people bath.
Plunge himself into the people bath and think while he walked, and enjoyed being around people. But then there was this newspaper, called the Corsair, which was like a low newspaper. I don't even know what it's kind of like. It's like a celebrity newspaper crossed with a tabloid. So like, I don't know, People magazine crossed with, I don't know, News of the World or National Enquirer. Do you still have National Enquirer?
I think we do.
But
there's tons of those now that the internet exists. So.
Yeah, and the whole point of this newspaper was that it liked to build up public figures and then tear them down again. It liked to sort of make fun of them. And one day Soren said, "Oh, well, to be insulted by the Corsair is a positive compliment, because they seem to only go for people who are trying to do something great." So he kind of said, "Come on, mention me." And the Corsair did. And then so for the next year or so, it relentlessly ran a kind of a campaign of caricature and mocked him. And it really hurt Soren quite socially. He couldn't go for his walks anymore. His name was sort of made fun of. People aren't called Soren. People for the next generation of people in Denmark, they weren't called Soren because of his association. So it was, he became like a real public figure of mockery. And it affected it affected his incarnational theology, which we'll talk about. And so, I mean, he unlike any theologian and philosopher today, he actually attracted public attention. And he also attracted public attention for his attack on Christendom, which is where by the end of his life, he really came out strongly against this cultural Christianity. And as a result, when he died, there was a bit of a riot at his funeral. Some of his supporters were offended that he was being buried in the official church of Denmark, the Lutheran church. And then some of his other supporters, they kind of muscled in and sort of pushed the angry roughs out of the church. And then there was a kind of almost a riot at his graveside as well, when one of his supporters sort of stood forward and denounced all of Denmark as the whore of Babylon. So again, the kind of stuff you don't normally get. Theologians today don't really rise that sort of attention. So I just find him really interesting. He's got his famously, you mentioned Regine. Mm-hmm. He's got a really sad and poignant love story kind of at the heart of a lot of his writing. He got engaged to this young girl. She's beautiful. If you see pictures of her, she was very smart. She was She seemed quite intelligent and funny. We have a lot of her memoirs. We have interviews of her after the fact, and she seems a great person. And they fell in love. But then pretty quickly, Soren kind of realized that he kind of thought of himself as sort of a curse to her. He didn't want to bring her into... He had quite a troubled family. Mm-hmm. His father and his brother didn't get along very well. And he didn't really want to bring her into that. And he also sort of, at this stage of him being engaged, was also around the time he's really starting to be a writer properly. And he had a real strong sense that basically God, or governance, he said, or was drawing him into a different life that was going to in clash with society, not maybe part of society. Yeah. And getting married to him was part of just becoming a normal middle-class citizen. So he had to orchestrate and engineer a way to break up with her in such a way that she wasn't shamed in public by it. So it's this kind of tragic love story at the heart of a lot of his work and his self-identity. Yeah.
When I had a theology small group in high school, and after we had read Cost of Discipleship, which got me all excited, we read Fear and Trembling, and I remember being super thrilled when undergrads started to get to read Kierkegaard in a philosophy class. And after the semester, the professor would take us, all the religion and philosophy majors that were in his seminar to go get Mexican food. And we did it every semester at the same restaurant. And it wasn't even good food. It's just where he went. and he said, and I remember going, well, why aren't there people like Kierkegaard today that you end up having to read, this person from, attacking Christendom hundreds of years ago, when we should just have today? He goes, oh, Christendom now is much more effective. They don't let you read them until you're already going in debt for school. And that way, that way you go in debt, you get married, and then no one has to ever bear the burden of being Kierkegaard. We can just read him and think of what would have been if we happened to have had the possibility. and I say that because I think when we start to look at what he says and what you kind of make the point, there's no school of Kierkegaard.
No,
he's this anomaly in a sense, and yet his life, both his love relationship, situation of family and money, made him able to have this space to be this type of public intellectual who's prophetic and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That is not easily cultivated in a kind of contemporary situation.
And he's a genius. I mean, he was writing, if you read his stuff, he's operating at a level far above the rest of us. And it's kind of ironic because he was writing all this stuff expecting that we would all be able to follow him, for each the different pseudonym. We'll talk about that, but the different pseudonyms, and we'd be able to understand the relationship between them all. And he was ironically, thought he was writing for the common man. But if you read his stuff, you just think that's no way.
You're like, if you have to do a thesis on the first fourth of it,
yeah,
to half understand it, it's probably not.
So he was operating at quite a high level, but a lot of it filters down. I don't believe in trickle-down economics, except in this case of Kierkegaard. Some of it does trickle down to us. And also his life was he didn't like philosophers and theologians very much. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't a theologian. He wasn't a philosopher. He gets lumped into those categories because we don't know where else to put him.
Yeah.
But he was somebody who was, this is part of his existentialism, and he really tried to walk the talk, to live the life. He kind of combined his life and his writing in such a way that we rarely see today, except maybe in somebody like a Bonhoeffer or something, who Bonhoeffer was influenced by Kierkegaard.
Mm-hmm.
So there is something quite singular and attractive about Soren, which you don't often see today, because he had removed himself from the academy, from the church, from some of those channels which capture, as you said, they capture people, they kind of lock them into a life where it's hard to speak against the person that's paying your wages, right? And he very deliberately removed himself from that, which is part of why he didn't get married. He was removing himself from the kind of world that was going to trap him so that he wouldn't be able to speak out. So, yeah, that's why we don't see too much of that today.
And his dad kept picking up his book bill.
Yeah, so he also inherited money. His dad paid for him for a while, and then when his dad died, he inherited the money, which he managed to the point where basically when Soren died, they looked into his bank account and he ran out of money. His life lasted for about as long as his money. And it worked for him.
Well,
singular vision he had.
So why is there not a Kierkegaard school or church? Like when we're looking at the different reasons, for going Kierkegaard, how do you imagine hearing them if you're not becoming a Bardian?
He very deliberately did not want there to be a Kierkegaardian school or church. I mean, he succeeded. This is by his design. Mm-hmm. Barth famously said everyone should go to the school of Kierkegaard, but they shouldn't stay there. Right? Which I know a lot of people feel that way about him. Which there's something to that, and Soren himself very deliberately, this is part of his pseudonyms. He was trying not to just be yet another celebrity Christian voice that everyone followed. He wasn't trying to be a reformer. He didn't think that his goal in life was to create a new movement which will follow me. I'm getting everything right. Yeah. He wasn't trying to do that. He was more like, he thought of himself as a fly stuck under the saddle of a horse, which keeps pricking the horse and making the horse kick and buck. He described himself as, he said, I'm the doctor who's forcing you to vomit up your sickness. Right. So he's trying to get you he's trying to arouse you, to awaken you, to offend you, but so that you would start to take your own life seriously. And he was deliberately aiming at people who already thought of themselves as Christian or part of a Christian culture. So the sense was, you use this words, you use this language, you say that you value it, but you don't look like it at all. There's something wrong here.
Yeah.
I want to wake you up. So he wasn't trying to get people to leave their church. He was trying to get people he's trying to get Christians to just act like Christians.
Mm-hmm. Well,
rather than trying to act like Kierkegaardians. And so his pseudonyms are part of that. He very deliberately wrote all these different voices, and then he said, look, when I write under a pseudonym, I don't want you to quote me.
Yeah.
Because the pseudonyms represent different types of people who live in Christendom.
And you mean he literally put other people's names on his books in case people are really unfamiliar.
Yeah.
Kierkegaard published lots of books and his name wasn't on it.
He arranged for books to be published. Sometimes he arranged for them to be published on the very same day, written under two different names, and they disagreed with each other. And he'd written them both, right? And he would write letters to the newspaper under a pseudonym complaining about Soren Kierkegaard. Or he would write under Soren Kierkegaard complaining about a pseudonym. And it was a bit like the internet, sock puppetry or something. And he was just trying to create a distance between himself and his books. Because he didn't want you to pick up a book and then look directly at Soren's life and say, oh, well, I'm just going to follow that guy. Or I'm not going to follow him because I don't like him. He wanted you to deal with the ideas themselves. Which is why when he was being made fun of publicly by the newspaper, that was such a hurtful thing for him, because it was collapsing that distance that he was trying to foster between his words and his life.
Yeah.
And that was being made impossible for him. Yeah.
So your first reason to go Kierkegaardian is because Kierkegaard's going to help you find the point.
The point.
And this is not the point of a needle with angels dancing on it and their numerical assessment. It's a different point.
So one of Kierkegaard's big ideas, he called it Øjeblikket, which I'm sure you know what that means in Danish.
It's very tweetable.
Yeah, Øjeblikket.
I'm sure it's blowing up right now.
Which in English, an English literal translation would be something like the eye blink. But in English, when we think of an eye blink, we tend to think of when the eye closes. But in Danish, the Øjeblikket is the moment when the eye opens. That flash, when everything is clear all at once. Mm-hmm. And so, which is why in English, we often more realistically or better translation of Øjeblikket in English is the moment, or the moment of vision. Mm-hmm. And there's a really important idea for Soren, and he kind of really paid attention to the moment, to how important it is to live in the present. So the point in time in which we live is very important. So one of the things that Soren wants us to do is to discover the point in time. One of the problems with Christendom is we have trapped ourselves into a view of history. We kind of think of the most important things happened 2,000 years ago. So Christendom says, I would have faith. If only I lived 2,000 years ago, I would have faith because I'd be there. Or maybe some parts of Christendom says it's all in the future. Mm-hmm. Jesus will come back one day and then we'll all be able to have faith. But for Soren, he really wants us to say, well, hang on. The problem with both of those views is that we've put what's most important about our lives either into the past or into the future. And the problem with that is that scheme of time, if you lock yourself into that, and you can have secular versions of this as well. If you lock yourself into that, there's one thing missing, which is the present. Mm-hmm. So what you've got is if you think of time as a timeline, you've trapped yourself into a thing where wherever you try and put your finger on the present, it disappears. Because as soon as you say, this is the present, oh, it's the past now. And it never exists. And Soren was like, this is a problem. Because not only is the present real, it's the only thing we know. So any system that traps your imagination into forgetting the present is a bad system, because you've forgotten the one thing we actually know and experience. And living in the present is the only way you and I are going to know each other. You can't know somebody in the past. You can't know somebody in the future. You can only know them in the present. So that's what humans share in common, the present. And then not only that, you got God. God is the only way that you're going to relate to God is in the present. So for Soren, he likes to point out that eternity isn't the far future that hasn't happened yet. Eternity is the eternal now, the eternal moment, right? So he's always trying to say, if you don't live in the present, you can't relate to each other and you can't relate to God. So what you need is this kind of, and you see it in the New Testament, today, God set aside and called it today. And he said, today, if you hear my voice, harden not your hearts, that kind of constant reminder that whatever the God relationship is, it is a relationship in the eternal present. So Soren was looking at these past history. He's looking, okay, so Jesus is an important figure. Is what's important about Jesus the fact that he lived 2,000 years ago? Or is there some way to be contemporaneous with Jesus? And so he thought the goal is to be, can you get these historical figures? Can you have them in a lively sense before you? Can you live in the moment with these historical figures? And that's the only way you're going to get to know them as present to you. So he told this story. Have you heard the story of the milkmaid?
Yes.
Right? You've heard the philosophical fragments of the milkmaid story, yeah?
Well, the philosophical fragments, it should be required reading. It's for everyone.
So this is his way of talking about contemporaneity. So once upon a time, right? Once upon a time there was a king, and he really was a king. You have to know this. And he fell in love with a milkmaid, and she really was the milkmaid. And he really did love her. So you have to know these three things. So one day, this king who was in love with the milkmaid, he said, I really want her to love me. So what am I going to do? If I show up to her milkmaid station in all my fine robes and my scepter, and I say, I love you, she will have to love me
as a king says.
As a king says, right?
Scepter in hand.
He really does love her. She will then say, oh, I love you too. But he'll always be wondering, is it just because I'm a king and she's scared of me, or she wants some of my riches? So he's got a dilemma, right? So then he goes, okay, well, what if I disguised myself as a shoeshine boy? So I'll disguise myself as a shoeshine, and I'll come alongside her and I'll get to know her. And then I'll say, I love you. And then she'll say she loves me. Oh, but I'm not really a shoeshine boy. I really am a king. So if I throw off my shoeshine boy rags and reveal the purple robes underneath, we're back to square one. It's the same problem again. So what do we do? So what he does is the king disguises himself as a shoeshine boy, and he gets alongside the milkmaid, and he gets to know her, and they fall in love. And he says, I love you. And she says, I love you too. And then he says, without throwing off the robes, I really am a king, you know. And that moment, we're the milkmaids, right, in front of Jesus. That the robe hasn't been revealed yet. The kingliness hasn't been revealed. It's just a guy who's maybe done some weird stuff. And the moment that Jesus says, I really am a king, you know, is the moment that we can choose to be offended by him or choose to believe him without being forced into it through some sort of triumphalism, without being rationally convinced of the 10 reasons why he rose from the dead. It's a person standing before you says, come unto me all who are weary and I will give you rest. And yet he's just a guy with a bit of fish in his beard who's saying it. And you have to react in the moment. So for Soren, he said, that's the moment. If faith is going to happen, it has to happen there, not in joining some triumphalistic group or becoming a clever clog at the university. It has to be that kind of emotional moment of the will.
I think like one of the things I've always loved about that story and has impacted me quite a bit. And I think this is a critique that he has towards different conservative and more liberal expressions of faith, that like faith is more like falling in love than a logical syllogism.
Yeah.
And when we either, right, like through historical criticism, engagement with pluralism or whatever, kind of whittle down the gospel to this ethical monotheism and the kingdom of God or whatever that progressives can work out with their Jesus seminar friends. Yeah. They're like, this is what it means. Yeah. Or like evidence that demands a verdict, line it up. Yeah. We got to go down the Roman road. You need to believe these things. Both of them miss that the whole reason for the incarnation and the whole reason for the king, right, to drop the scepter and start shining shoes and get calluses wasn't just to invade the world, but to love and persuade the world that this love God has for is genuine. And the response God wants is not something anyone can give for another.
No, this is the really important thing for Kierkegaard. He's saying, I can't hand you Christianity on a silver platter. He says this. I'm not a waiter. I can't hand it to you on a platter and lift the lid and there it is. He's like, this is a thing that you are a subject. You're not an object. God is a subject. God is not an object. Like, if you don't know God as a person, and if he doesn't know you as a person, then you don't know God at all. It's a one-to-one relationship, you know.
I mean, if you think of the image of just opening the eye and waking up, and you were to ask anyone who's been in love for a while, like you're like, hey, tell me about you and Alicia's relationships. Yeah. When were you fully present? When are the moments like your eyes opened to something that was more beautiful and true than you had before? Yeah. I would have very explicit stories to tell you. Yeah. Like, you know, the first time we were dating. Stories. But and like just the time you realized when she said she forgave you, she meant it in a way you didn't. You're like, I didn't know I could hurt someone like that and hear it. Yeah, for sure. Or the time you hold your baby together for the first time, or in little mundane moments. Like you can think back in relationships that completely shape you, and none of it. If I explained it to you, like, oh, Tripp, why do you love Alicia? Yeah, I'm not going to explain it to you and go, well, you know, I'd like to marry her as well. Yeah, that's just not going to be the response. You're going to go, that is a love story. Yeah. And what happens, I think, with Christendom and with this kind of cultural, like, wet blanket you put on faith is you think somehow that there's only one love story when it comes to God, and it's transferable by objective conclusions. And in Kierkegaard's picture is more, I don't know. It doesn't abandon agape and erotic love are tied together, right? In this real visceral sense that I like even in philosophical fragments there, where it's like, this is one of the differences between Socrates and Jesus. Socrates succeeds and he goes, good job, we're done. Yeah. Jesus succeeds and you go, I love you, and I'm with you.
Socrates he compares these two teaching styles. And so the point of Socrates is to try and bring out the truth from within you and then disappear. Socrates succeeds when he's become forgotten. He's not trying to dominate. Jesus is the message. He's not bringing out a message. He is the message. He says, I am the way. So only in the relationship to that. I mean, you talked about the incarnation. I mean, so for Kierkegaard, it's kind of like, he basically said, this is my summary. He basically says, I can't prove it, but if the incarnation happened in any way like Christianity says it does, then that event is the most important event in the history of events happening. Mm-hmm. Everything else revolves around the incarnation. It isn't the beginning of a thing. It's Christendom says, oh, 2,000 years later, we've got it. We're the highest revelation.
We finally got it figured out right here.
if you can explain yourself without constant reference to the incarnation, without constantly being contemporaneous with this man who says, I am God, I'm really a king, then you're doing it wrong. Because this is God, the creator of the universe, who says, this is what I look like. So Kierkegaard's philosophy, if it is a philosophy, is all about trying to constantly curve time and history back to that point, rather than see history as progressively linear, which both sort of progressives do, obviously, but also the kind of golden age conservatives do too. The idea that you link your God's highest revelation for mankind in whatever social, cultural context you happen to be in.
Well, and conservatives will do it in a different way, just because you'll end up with a situation where you look at the present and you're like, oh, it's going to get worse because it's going to this other thing. And Kierkegaard's like,
yeah,
no, the incarnation, God giving God's self to the world, is not something that God did once just to then wait around to do it again.
No,
that promise that's revealed in Christ is one that's for you.
Yeah.
And I mean, there he's like really being a good Lutheran, right? Like that pro-me aspect of faith, that we know God because of God's love and works for us.
Yeah.
And so it's not like the further away you get from the incarnation, the power's being disillusioned.
No. No.
And that's why I remember, now I can't remember which book it's in, where he's talking about the contemporaneous nature of the disciple. And he's like, it wouldn't have done you any good to be one of his disciples.
No. Yeah.
And honestly, like, they hung out with him for 3 years and then ran once it got to the crescendo.
Well, and the New Testament is a completely biased book. I mean, it's propaganda meant to convince you that Jesus Christ is Lord, right? It's propaganda. And even the New Testament cannot hide the fact that most people who met Jesus were offended by him and rejected him. Most people did, including his disciples. Yeah. Just reading this in John today, he talks about, I'm the flesh, who eats my flesh and drinks my blood. And they were offended. Who can, Kierkegaard points out, the miracles are not proof of Jesus' divinity. They are proof that something weird has happened. And you still have to. So John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus. Are you the one that we're expecting? And Jesus says, go back to John and tell him this. You've seen the lame walk, the deaf hear, the blind see. And the next line is, blessed is he who is not offended at me. So even in the New Testament, as Kierkegaard points out, being offended at Jesus was tightly connected to actually being present in front of his miracles. So Christendom tends to treat, certain types of Christians tend to treat the miracles as like this knockdown proof that Jesus was God. And, these silly Jews, if only we were there, it's quite anti-Semitic actually, if only we were there, we would have known, of course, that Jesus was God. But these Jews, they had their chance and then they lost it, And Kierkegaard says, no, the people who were present had just the same problem that we've got. Because all they saw was a man who was claiming and doing these crazy things. And they still had to choose, like, am I offended by this or not? And he said that same offense exists today. There's no real difference.
And the offense is not just at the level of attributing to Jesus, like, his identity as Lord.
No.
It's also at the level of definition of what the Lord does.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, Peter gets asked the question, who do people say I am? And he lists off all sorts of pretty decent answers considering all the stuff Jesus has done.
Yeah.
He says, who do you say I am? Oh, Son of the living God. And he's like, good, Dad told you.
Yeah.
And then coming off of the Mount of Transfiguration, and he goes to Jerusalem, and it's becoming clear what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's when you get, whoa, Jesus, if you're the Son of the living God, why are you going to go there? You're going to get killed.
Right.
And then you get behind me, Satan. And
it's political, which is where we're going to get to the next thing.
Yeah, but the offense, I think people need to realize, and this is one of the things I love so much about Kierkegaard. He has that prayer where he says that Christ is both the model and the means.
Yeah.
And it's not just, you call him Lord, you pray some prayer and that helps you out.
No.
It's also the means and the model for our living. And I think American Christianity has gotten hooked where it's just Jesus as model for living and good ideas and acting social, progressive justice or whatever. Yeah. And others like access to God. And Kierkegaard goes, separate the two and you ruin to both sides.
Yeah.
And it's because both of them contain offense to when we locate our identity in any kind of socially given accidental construct that we inherit because of where we happen to be in the world.
Yeah.
Be it you're Danish or you're American or whatever our second point is. So
this is where
I was scared my love for Kierkegaard would distract us from doing 5 points. And
this is where he's really useful.
Yeah,
he gives us an example. I described my second point as he's going to help you just articulate what the beep is wrong with Christianity in your country. And by your country, I mean America, but I also mean any country you're in, which is Christianized. So Kierkegaard understands the highly political nature of being a disciple.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, a lot of these problems of, you talked about sort of 10 reasons that demand a verdict or whatever, and a lot of that is at root, it's actually about joining our group. Come join our group. And he sees a lot of Christianity in the modern age as not about Jesus, but about joining our group. It's about trying to, take the levers of power or control the culture or whatever it is. It's all about, for him, he uses the one word, Christendom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when Americans hear I don't know, when you hear Christendom, what do you think?
I'm pretty sure the Pope's involved.
Right.
Not in definitely Rome, places without as much freedom and
Europe,
liberty as we have.
Yeah. And you think of like established churches. We don't have
not nearly as many Christian radio stations. Like we have lots of them.
So what a lot of people hear when they hear the word Christendom, or they think the attack on Christendom was an attack on the established church of Denmark. And it was so much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the headline you need to know is that America is a better example of Christendom than even Denmark was. So
now, you also have to let people know that's not a compliment, because
Christendom in Soren's world isn't just the church and state together.
Mm.
It's what happens when you have American exceptionalism. It's the idea of God has raised up this nation for this time in history. God's revelation is best known in this cultural group now. If you join our culture, if you're part of our culture, if you're touched by our culture, you're being touched by God, right? That's Christendom, which is so much more than just an established church. Established church is kind of part of it. But you can have Christendom without ever having an established church. Wherever you find a culture that strongly believes, even in a secular way, that we are the high point of history. We're on the top of the pile. And it might sound funny to you, but I mean, in Denmark, there are people who say, we are God's mouthpiece to the world. Scandinavian language. This is one of Kierkegaard's great opponents named Grundtvig. And he said, the Scandinavians are God's voice to the world, and it's all very Hegelian.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that history is constantly developing in a linear progress, and wherever you find the most, G.K. Chesterton made fun of it, this myth of liberal progress, right? Wednesday is better than Tuesday because it's most recent. And Kierkegaard saw this happening, in the 19th century. He's like, this is crazy to think that whatever we are right now is the best there is, or is the most godly there is. And that you joining a culture and being civilized into a certain Christianized culture is the same as being a Christian, a follower of Christ, a disciple of Christ. So he really kind of showed, he's like, actually groups and joining the herd or joining a crowd or being born into a culture, that's a sign of human weakness, because we can't deal with an individual in all their glory. Mm-hmm. You and I cannot deal with individuals. Eventually, we have to abstract them into groups because we can't deal with it. The only person in the universe who can deal with every single individual as a full individual in all her glory is God. All right? God doesn't see groups. God only sees individuals. God doesn't see the big picture. We talk about seeing the big picture as if that's God's eye view. And Kierkegaard says, no, God only sees every tiny detail. There is no big picture. For us, a big picture is because we can't see tiny details. We grow tired and weary of them, and we can't encompass them. So much of Christendom thinking for him was this numerical, turning Christianity into something numerical. Look how many years we've been Christian. Look how many people there are who call themselves Christian. Look how many countries our country owns or has influence over, or whatever you want to do. It kind of reduces the truth of Christianity to the success in numbers.
He tells that parable about the brewer who starts selling beer for less than it costs to make it.
Yeah.
And then it's like, look at my sales. This is amazing.
Yeah.
And
somebody comes along and says, yeah, but you're selling it for 10 cents less than it costs you to make. And he's like, yeah, but look at all the bottles I'm selling. I must be doing something right.
Which is good. That's why American evangelists have never undersold the gospel to make it really compelling. But the one place you never find people selling very cheap beer is at youth camps with small little teenagers, very tired, and you usually don't associate beer with very graphic descriptions of the bloody body of Jesus. So it doesn't apply directly. But
it is easy to dismiss. This is obviously a kind of a more conservative way of thinking, like God bless America. American patriotism is the same as Christianity, or America is a force for good in the world, as opposed to just a force for America in the world. That kind of, you do find that obviously it's a really conservative way of thinking, but it's not only, how many of you lefty progressives, did your heart go pitter patter when Obama said, we're on the right side of history? Or, that kind of progressiveness itself is also part of the problem for Soren. It's like you're just associating something that's right and true with your point in history. And you don't need constant reference to the incarnation to be a liberal progressive. Mm-hmm. So you might be a nice guy at a party, but you're not a Christian. You're not articulating yourself with constant reference to the incarnation. Progressives,
we like to add the word "al" on the doctrines.
Right.
So we say we're incarnation al.
Right.
And
right.
And I've had a number of arguments with people on the podcast that I'm not sure that's helpful when it goes to the incarnation.
Right.
Not because the incarnation would not show us that discipleship would mean with our power, influence, privilege, and things we would do like the king does, right? Like that in whatever ways we have the mind of Christ, we lower ourselves for the benefit of others.
Yeah.
It's not saying that, but there's something that gets missed the moment the incarnation gets universalized.
Yeah, for sure.
And then becomes a ubiquitous potential at every moment of history.
Kierkegaard had a very good line. He said, Jesus didn't become mankind. He became a man. And that's important. Mm-hmm. The incarnation isn't an abstract idea that represents the glorification of a culture or a type of, or even the human race. It's a guy who you maybe heard fart. And then he turns around and says, come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest.
It depends on.
It's visceral, right? Kierkegaard's very interesting because he's not, he doesn't even really care if you become a Christian or not. This is what a lot of people don't sort of realize, is he very, over and over again, he's like, I'm not trying to make you become a Christian. I'm just trying to point out what Christianity actually is, so that you can then decide whether you actually want to be one or not.
And he's kind of like, well, I'm working on it.
Yeah, and a part of his scheme was to say, look, I'm not claiming I am the great Christian that you should follow me. I'm just saying, I happen to know that if you want to call yourself a Christian, then this Christ fellow is quite important.
And so one of the stories you do a great job in the book describing is his like love-hate relationship with the bishop. That is, they have a relationship early on, then he has friends trying to fight for power, and then and it's death. Like how tell us like what that attack of Christendom looked like in on his streets, because I think a lot of us. You could read the book itself, right? Like, and you would go, yeah, that's probably real easy sitting out on the outside like that. But when you told multiple stories in the book where I was like, oh, junk, he published this and was going to their house for tea.
Yeah.
And he had family members that were involved. And then he has like his neighbors and his friends.
He named and shamed people by name.
Yeah.
So Soren was kind of himself he was trying to deliberately, so let me back up. If one of the most important things about Jesus was that he is the possibility of offense. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus was a big jerk. He was offensive by, loving the Samaritan woman or healing a leper or whatever. Like, he's offensive because he's running counter to common culture.
Well, and you mentioned John earlier, the offense, like
Yeah.
in the prologue itself, it said that, the word came to his own and they
Yes.
knew him not.
Yeah.
It's the offense has to do with the distance between the infinite and the finite, and the distance that a lot of travels of what's like
and
when
it's
engages
when
it.
you face that as a person, you're churned up.
Yeah.
So the offense is more that you're churned up, and you now have a point. We're going to probably talk about angst in a bit, but you have a choice to make. So he said, okay, Jesus was the catalyst always for that choice that people had to make, and they choose to either be offended or to have faith in him.
Mm.
As a Christ imitator of Christ, as a Christ follower, one of the first things you'll start to notice, this is how you spot true Christ followers, according to Kierkegaard, is they also will start to be catalysts for potential for offense, right?
Mm.
They're going to start breaking things up that everybody else assumes is really safe. So one of the things he started to do was, there was this bishop named Münster who died, and he was a great old, see, you guys don't have an established church here, so it's hard to describe. I don't know, maybe Billy Graham or somebody who's like, people might not agree with him, but everybody knows he's a good man. Right?
Well, at least, mostly.
Yeah, maybe he's the closest.
Especially in comparison to his son.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of somebody who's relatively beloved, relatively has a pretty high stock in terms of like his.
I think
character.
Jimmy Carter might count.
Jimmy Carter, maybe.
The worst president that everyone's like, only one term. He's the best ex-president, good old Baptist, the Sunday school teacher from Georgia.
It might be impossible to find a parallel here because America is so different in a way. But this guy was a beloved bishop, and he was very genteel, he was very civilized, and he really strongly equated Christianity with being civilized. And when he died, the next bishop who was going to take over stood up and said, "Oh, Münster was a real true martyr, true witness to the faith. The great line of martyrs stretches from Peter all the way up to Münster." And Soren is sitting here sort of vibrating in his pew because he's hearing this guy being described as a true witness to the faith. And in fact, he's like, this guy presided over the death of Christianity in our culture, not any witness to it. And so he wrote a scathing sort of newspaper article, an editorial, directly denouncing this beloved old guy who Kierkegaard himself knew and loved, but he did it as a kind of a way to he's a stick to the hornet's nest. He was shaking things up on purpose. So he started that launched the attack on Christendom, which was this sort of public and publicly offensive onslaught on the beloved figures of the age, which really sort of became the thing he was known for at the end of his life, that he was notorious for. But he always did it in this is why it's interesting. In writing, he was it's very funny. If you read the Attack on Christendom material, which is actually potentially a good one to start with, actually. Mm-hmm. It's very funny. It's very angry. It's very righteously angry, but you can totally tell there's a Christian heart beating under all that. But in person, we've got multiple eyewitnesses telling us that Kierkegaard remained loving and friendly and kind, and somebody says that the light of Jesus was shining from his eyes. There's a whole lot of eyewitness testimony saying he didn't become this cranky old man, even though he was writing cranky old man kind of stuff. So even that writing, there's a distance between him and the writing. The writing is serving a purpose. He's not inhabiting everything he's writing. He's very deliberately trying to wake you up, cause a bit of offense, make you vomit by making fun of or calling out people that you normally think are so beloved, and he's trying to shake you up. So, yeah.
Well, one of the difference, if back then you did not have this consistent public attack on Christendom, I think today it is a blogger sport to attack Christendom. And what you notice in reading your book is just that, the scathing critiques are one part of his relationship with everyone he's talking about.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like he's talking about people he didn't know.
No.
And weren't friends with.
Yeah, exactly.
And that. And I think a lot of
it wasn't
the way American Christianity works, we get so put in an echo chamber, and all of our scathing critiques are on people we've never hung out with.
Yeah, and it's the tribalism. I mean, part of his problem with Christendom was this tribalism, these factions fighting each other for dominance. And that's precisely what Christianity looks like in this country, in America. I mean, it's just, like you said, people live in these little hermetic seals, and they only listen to and talk to people who sound like them and look like them. And for Kierkegaard, he said that impulse is precise, that tribalist impulse is the one that's precisely that Christianity is not about. It's about not only collecting with people who look like you and sound like you as much as possible. And the only reason we do that is because we can't deal with individuals. We can only deal with groups. And we try and create these groups that we feel safe in. And we hope the group does our job for us. And he says Jesus is forever calling people out of their groups, forever sort of shaking up, taking a stick to the hornet's nest to get the bees out.
Yeah.
Not because he hates the bees, because the hive isn't very good for the bees. They need to get out. So that's kind of what he's doing with this thing. So I don't know what the equivalent would be. I mean, maybe on Veterans Memorial Day or something, standing up in an evangelical church and pushing the American flag over or something. I mean, that's the kind of thing he's doing. He's not attacking people so much as he was attacking ideas that are being held sacred, which didn't deserve that language. They didn't serve sacredness, So he's just trying to shake people's beliefs up, and he did it by calling out a few people. But he didn't hate those people as persons. Yeah.
No, I that was one of the things I thought stuck out in the book itself.
But it's not all bad. I mean, Kierkegaard can help you find out what the bleep is right with your country.
Well, that's point 3. We're moving so quickly through these. Yeah. So what is right? I love. I mean, I know we're exceptional as Americans.
Christendom has smuggled within it the means of its own demise. I mean, the good news is the gospel, right? And it's through Christendom. I mean, you and I are both products of Christendom. Kierkegaard met Jesus through Christendom as well. It is our Christianized cultures that have preserved the story of Jesus for us. I mean, so even if our Christianized culture, you often notice this. I mean, pay attention to how many, a lot of Christendom can't really deal with Jesus very well. So people who call themselves Christian, I was looking at this, it was an American exceptionalism kind of blog, website, and they're talking about freedom and this kind of stuff. And I think it had to do with violent protection of what is rightfully yours. Very important to a lot of American identity, right? You got to violently protect what's rightfully yours.
Well, that's why we all have guns.
Right. And here's this Christian blog talking about Christianity to Christians. And the only time Jesus was mentioned was to explain him away. Yes, we know Jesus said, turn the other cheek, but that wouldn't work very well. Like if we were to obey that.
Because it worked great then.
Because a country can't be run on those principles. So therefore, Jesus probably didn't mean that or whatever. And I just thought, isn't that interesting? Like the only time this Christian ever mentioned Jesus Christ was to explain him away. And there's this kind of but there was a bit of hope in there because he still had to deal with it. He still had to deal with the fact that Jesus was he was a non-violent, in the face of violence, he practiced non-violence, and he did counsel his people not to practice violent protection of what's rightfully theirs. And he does act as a grit in the system, even the system that has built itself on him. So this idea that authentic Christianity happens all over the place, wherever the gospel is there. And it's that Bonhoeffer sense as well. I can't win an argument. He says, I'm going to hold the gospel out to you with an open hand. And this is Kierkegaardian as well. So it'll lose every argument. I mean, it's easy to dismiss, but at least it's there. And it's just for you to choose or not. I can't force you to like it or not, but at least it's there. And so Christendom, even in this country, has produced the means by which the gospel is still there. And it still can be discovered by people. So, and then on top of that is that authentic, that kind of, we do value people who walk the talk, who practice what they preach, And I think you'll find that in any Christian denomination. I mean, we, in this country, but in Europe as well, we have a value for people who are, we don't know how to describe an authentic Christian, but we know there's a difference between a nominal Christian and an authentic Christian. And you ask anybody, any room, what is an authentic Christian? You'll get multiple answers. But we all know there's something there, right? There's a difference between just being born. Are you a Christian? Oh, my skin is white and I speak English. We're like, yeah, no, there's something more than just racial affiliation or cultural. We know that. And so Kierkegaard really helps us to articulate that.
He talks about the knight of faith.
Yeah. You can recognize him. He said, the knight of faith looks like everybody else, but there's something about him that's different. And it's because he's got this relationship with God where he can he can sort of lay down everything. He's not holding tightly to everything that's rightfully his, actually. He can lay it down. That's what the leap of faith is about. You lay something down at the same time as you think you're getting it back again. And there's this kind of movement he calls it the leap.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, we get the phrase leap of faith because of Kierkegaard as well. But and he didn't mean a jump into the dark. He doesn't mean that.
What about, like having a really sweet movie with Indiana Jones?
Or Steve Martin.
Yeah.
That's an underrated movie, that one, Leap of Faith with Steve Martin.
Well, that's because you didn't grow up, and it seemed very documentary style for some people.
Well, yes, I know about that. Well, yeah, Indiana Jones, The Leap of Faith. There we go. There's Kierkegaard inside Indiana Jones. I never knew that before. Yeah, but so there's some good stuff. Like, Christendom still preserves the value of Jesus Christ. And it works really hard to dismiss Jesus, or to... Kierkegaard described lots of biblical scholars and theologians as he said, we're like naughty boys who know we're going to get a spanking, and so we have to stuff a lot of linen napkins down our underpants so that we don't feel the pain. So for him, he was like, that's what theologians and pastors are like. We know that Jesus said these things, but before we preach it, we're going to put in layers and layers and layers of, well, we know he said this, but today this is what it really means, or here's what the original Greek would have meant, and we find ways to pad it out, right?
Well, I remember a preacher saying, well, Jesus said, if you live by the sword, you'll die by it. But he said absolutely nothing about a handgun.
Wow.
And he didn't. It's true. I've read the whole Bible.
He didn't.
No handgun, no handguns.
Yeah. So there you go. But I mean, even that church, which is an ultimate example of Christendom, even they've got a Bible there.
Yeah.
And some poor soul is going to pick up that Bible and might actually read it. So there's some good stuff. I mean, and then they might start to take it seriously for themselves, which is that kind of, there is an individualism, I think, that's quite healthy. Kierkegaard was absolutely an individualist, and we all know it has problems. Individualism has its own problems, but there is something healthy about saying, my group that I'm a part of is not the whole of my identity.
Well, and I think part of it is, for some people, individualism is giving universal significance to the pseudo-self, which is just a social construction of where you happen to be in the world.
Yeah.
And Kierkegaard's is not that. Yeah. It's actually a selfhood that comes into being through God, through an encounter with God.
Through constantly referencing the incarnation. Your personhood is related to your relationship to the incarnation, not to your relationship to your church or culture or family or anything like that.
Or your possessions. Or the prestige you have in a situation, the power and influence you can. And I think that when we recognize those type of things, you can see why. I know you said like Kierkegaard is like salt on a lot of foods. Right. You would never want to make a whole meal out of it.
No,
but you could see how a million of them would get better if you put salt on it. Yeah, for sure. So what's number 4?
Well, this kind of relates to what you're talking about. I mean, Kierkegaard will help you become a person if you go with Kierkegaard. Mm-hmm. Why go Kierkegaard? He'll help you become a person.
Well, I feel like I support being a person.
There's a lot of people running around who aren't persons yet. This is a kind of an existentialist move. The idea that like personhood is a task. It's a movement. You're not just born a person. You might be born a human being, but you're not born a person. Personhood it comes over time, or it's a development. And so for Kierkegaard, he's really interested in like the difference between the herd and the crowd and an individual. And he always wrote for the single individual, and I called my book the Kierkegaard A Single Life, partly because of that. And he's constantly like saying, I want anybody who reads my book can become this single person. I'm not saying he's not elitist. He's saying anyone can do this, and everyone can be a single person. But to do that, you have to give up that temptation of letting your country or your creed or whatever do all the work for you, all the heavy lifting. Because for one thing, it can't. It's not that good. These principalities and powers and institutions that we construct, they claim for themselves that in us you live and move and have your being. But they can't actually deliver on that promise, So there's this sort of sense that he's constantly saying, come out of those groups, become a person, be rooted in the person who you really do live and move and have your being, and then you can go back into true sociality, right?
Well, one of the things and maybe this would be a time to kind of talk about how he used it, is by writing with pseudonyms, the task of becoming a person, he captures by indirect communication and by using these pseudonyms to describe, he talks about like these different stages along life's way and this type of thing. Can you describe why he would never have a lecture titled "A Discussion on No Longer Being Part of the People but Becoming a Person"? Like the whole task of becoming a person was not something he wouldn't hand you a Cliff Notes on it.
No,
and
because it's a job. I mean, this is part of his. So he gets he has a famous phrase: "Truth is subjectivity," which, you know, if you ever read Francis Schaeffer.
Yes.
Schaeffer's responsible for a lot of Christians, certainly in this country, not liking Kierkegaard. Because Schaeffer saw that kind of stuff, and he's like, oh, this is all moral relativism and subjectivism and this kind of stuff. And Kierkegaard said truth is subjectivity, not because he didn't think you generated the truth from within yourself. What he meant was, I said this before, you are a subject. You're not an object, you know. And God is a subject. God is not an object. And you get to know an object by pushing it away so you can see all its angles, you know. You get to know a subject by inviting them in to a relationship, by knowing them, right? So truth is subjectivity for Kierkegaard. You're not going to know truth by pushing it away and objectively, rationally, you know, examining all its different angles. You're only going to know it by actually sort of being in it and then stepping out and actually like trying to imitate Christ and then relying on the Holy Spirit to unlock the scriptures for you. Kierkegaard has a really high view of the New Testament, but he says it's a dead letter unless the Holy Spirit's going to awaken it in you.
And it turns it into a love letter.
Yeah.
Which is like the opposite of how I was, like you'd rarely hear people say, well, you know, sacred scripture, it's a love letter.
Right.
Like, cause you read love letters differently.
Yeah. You read it differently than,
things I've never done with long letters from my wife. Take a few passages out of it.
Right.
Remove any of the details of the actual historical situation in which that letter was occasioned.
Right.
Find a few phrases and then, and say, yep, those are true. Right. Like that's just, no one would ever do that to a love letter. And
issues of truth and falsity
I feel like it's the hang up of, the allergy people have the word subjectivity.
Yeah. Because
sometimes I will see someone like really, I guess we can blame Francis Schaeffer I'm down for that. You know, for that type of phobia. But then if you watch them with their family and friends and things, they completely like betray the critique of subjectivity they're talking about. Of course. Because you remain a good partner in a marriage and in your family by refusing to make them an object. Yeah. Because the moment they become an object, you're then assuming they're just a construct in your mind, the things you're projecting on them and all that.
Yeah.
You remain in loving relationship because you let them remain a mystery. And
yeah, right.
And it's that process of like part of being a person for Kierkegaard is keeping the future open. And that the subjectivity is an insistent that the relationship is not something that is established and settled.
No.
But it's always something that's being engaged.
So he wrote a really good book called Works of Love, which is a long reflection on thou shalt love your neighbor, right? And love your God, but specifically the neighbor. And he's very interested in like, what's the difference between, you know, a nationhood and a neighborhood? You know, what's the logic of patriotic love, which is that kind of, eventually it's like, I want to be with people who are sound like me and look like me as much as possible. That's the logic of kind of nationalism. You know, it's like, eventually we're trying to draw boundaries around who is worthy of our love.
Right.
Right. When you're doing the patriotic love, you're basically kind of saying, love it or leave it. You know, eventually there's a line which you're going to be inside or outside.
It's easier to see if there's a wall there, though.
Oh yeah, the wall's going to be really handy when that comes up. But this idea is like it uses the patriotism, uses the language or the ideas of we're all in this together. It's unity. It's common bond. It's for everyone, or it's for lots of people, right? But Kierkegaard goes, but look at the trajectory of that. If I'm only ever around people who look like me and sound like me as much as possible, the ultimate horizon is me.
Yeah.
I'm moving towards, and this is the logic of patriotism. It's forever sloughing off people who don't count anymore until you get to the one kind of core group that all look like you and sound like you as much as possible. And this is the logic of that kind of love. And he says, look, this pretends to be for everyone, but it's really only about me. It's very ultimately selfish and nihilistic. What's the opposite? Well, the neighbor. I'm commanded to love my neighbor, even if he doesn't look like me or sound like me.
Yeah.
I'm commanded to love him, even if he's my enemy, right? So there's this idea that the logic of neighborhood is running counter to the logic of nationhood. And that the best way to describe an individual, if you try and describe an individual, if somebody said, describe Tripp to me, and I said, oh, he's an American, I've instantly cut off loads of other things about you that are even more important than your nationality, right? Whereas we live in a world which likes to claim that certain things about you, whatever group you're part of or whatever race you are or whatever language you speak or whatever, is what identifies your sum total personhood. And for Kierkegaard, he said, actually, that stuff is only abstracts the individual. What we need is a word like the neighbor, which is, I'm supposed to love you in all of your identities without reducing you to any one. And the neighbor is the best way to describe that. You know, it's the person you're supposed to love, even if they don't meet any of your other requirements for moral equivalence, whatever that, you know. So, yeah, so for him, when he talks about loving your neighbor, he sees that as quite a deep identity language, you know, of how to construct relationship without reference to tribalism.
And and I think one part of the neighbor love for him is that in being this kind of obligation to seek to love the neighbor, it's not just for your neighbor's sake.
No.
But in learning to love your neighbor, as Christ commanded, you're learning to actually sit in the conditions where it's possible for you to be loved fully by God.
Yeah.
Like when our identity is being constructed and protected by boundaries we put up.
Yeah.
The boundaries are not just between the other who should be your neighbor. They're also between you and God.
Yeah,
they become protective and that we close ourselves off. And in a that's one of the places you see that kind of inward turning protectiveness in him that echoes a lot of what Luther's picking back up from Augustine, when in the way in which
sin is the self curved in on itself, right? Yeah.
And I wonder, and this, I have no idea what you're going to say. I thought of it when I was reading the book and then thinking, oh, he does politics and theology and stuff. So
that was my first book on Kierkegaard.
So there are two things that I think are connected to this question. One is, today, a lot of our questions around selfhood turn into political fights to be recognized.
Yeah.
So there's a whole logic of recognition that is really part of post-Christian ethics.
Yeah.
In the West, so it's connected to kind of a public square. So we argue for the recognition of different groups or different parts of ourselves or identities.
Yeah.
And we see ourselves as having succeeded when more are included in the whole. Right. So let's say, when you're arguing for nationalism in the United States, we have made genuine progress that you have a Supreme Court that has no Protestants on it in the United States.
Right.
Now, I might not like all the Catholics and Jewish people that are on there, and they might vote in different ways, but there's a different thing we mean when we say American today than we did when you would never have thought of anyone serving in the government that wasn't Protestant of some sort.
Okay.
Right. So they were recognized and included. Or we have fights in churches over who gets included, be it, women can now be ministers or whatever, or gay and lesbians can, but I don't know about transgendered people or whatever. Yeah. But what it creates is this sense where if Kierkegaard is pointing out the problematic nature of being determined by the herd, there also is a sense that I am uncomfortable with when our identity is determined by the recognition of the other and not the neighborly love of the other, or that we succeed by getting people to now be included in the system that's the case. Because part of his critique is...
I think the logic of do you use multiculturalism very much here in this country?
Yeah, people will use it, but that sense where like is Christendom, like if we just took Christendom in a broad sense, is it challenged now that more people are included in it, or is that just the logic of its self-perpetuation by having more and more people included, but never, questioning the game in a sense?
Yeah, I mean,
capitalism works better if we're less prejudiced, because then there are more labor, right, available, and the labor goes down, and that kind of thing. In a church that gets its identity by either including or not including someone, they're equally dodging the question that what is being included or not included to is problematic. And
well, of course it is problematic. I mean, again, often a Christian response to these things would be not this way is always right, or this is the way we're going to do it, it's always right. It's more who goes less wrong less often, or who goes more right more often, who goes less wrong less often? The people who try and define their church according to tribal lines, or the people who are trying to create a neighborhood, a church as a neighborhood as opposed to a church as a mini nation, and of course, there's going to be problems of that. And one of the problems, so a lot of Christians, I don't know if you're one of these ones, but I'm certainly one. I work in political theology circles where loads of my colleagues, we're totally aware that Christianity is not right or left. It's something else, it's an alternative, right? We like to say that, but then
there's at least 3% of Christians that are.
We always become right or left, Yeah. And I think Kierkegaard's really helpful because he's like genuinely trying to just transcends and avoids that language, and he sees all that right and left squabbling as yet more kind of tribalism, yet more rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And the idea is like, actually, there's something else the church can be creating. If a church is created not on common agreement, we're not building a church based on common agreement. We're building a church based on mutual recognition of disciples. Mm-hmm. So you look around, you're like, who is imitating Christ? It's like your head pops up over the crowd and you see somebody else who's also sticking out. Mutual recognition. That's where the church comes from in a Kierkegaardian sense. It's this kind of neighborhood of mutually recognized individuals, as opposed to this kind of conglomeration as crowd moving its way through the system, trying to agitate for its own rights and its own voice and stuff. And there's something about a Kierkegaardian Christian is quite happy with thinking my Christianity is not going to make me a better citizen. Mm-hmm. So we tend to, a lot of Christendom Christianity is really addicted to thinking that the point of Christianity is to help grease the wheels of society.
Like you're a good employee, you're a good student.
Being a Christian will make you a better judge, a better soldier, a better nurse, a better accountant, right?
Drone operator.
Right, exactly. Well, it doesn't take long before you find out actually being a Christian, a Christian, will make you a highly suspect drone operator, nurse, accountant. I mean, there's loads. It's not like we're not doing this pie in the sky kind of, abstract thinking. Like, it's pretty easy to imagine being a Christian does not make life easier.
It doesn't even make it easy to be a parent.
Right, exactly.
Because being a successful parent is getting your kids to internalize the law of a culture that is not necessarily thrilled with the call to love your neighbor.
Right. And so for Kierkegaard,
and half the time you discover it while you're teaching it to your kids. Right. I mean, at least that's been, I always thought, what would it have been like if Kierkegaard was a parent? Because all the things you can see externally, right, when you're like before having kids.
Yeah.
And you just are, when you're reading Kierkegaard, smoking your pipe and just letting it fly, unawares that you're on a scholarship to a university that's kind of inheriting Christendom galore.
Right.
Right. Like, and you're just like, stick it to Christendom. Then the moment you become a parent.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, I totally just told my kid to do exactly what the truth regime that is inherently problematic and antithetical to the gospel wants him to do.
Yeah.
And then you're sitting there going, oh my God, I am the problem.
Yeah.
Like talk about
indoctrinating, group thinking.
And then you're like trying to cite it. And so there are a lot of Americans, that hook Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein together and have themselves a heyday. And I had a professor who was that and managed to get Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein in almost any class he taught. And I remember early, our first kid, Elgin, was, 2, 3. And I thought, well, we got to teach him that, half of ethics is just instilling, the logic of totalism in your head and connected to language games. So we were going, and by we, I mean, I did not tell my wife, I just decided to do it. Not use, normal words for like poop and stuff.
Okay.
We were only going to use curse words. And like, if he said like I pooped, like, don't say that. It's shit here.
Okay.
And like when you, and I thought, this is great. I mean, we're not Platonists. There's no, in my head. And then, we're having, calls from the preschool.
Yeah.
And they're
It's not
like,
conforming.
Elgin just said he needed to go take a shit.
Yeah.
And Alicia's like, you told him what? And I'm like, look, we fell in love while reading philosophical investigations. And, and she's like, yeah, but you don't want to do that to him. I'm like, do it to him. It might be the most freeing thing ever. And then like by the third time it happens, Elgin's like, Dad, why didn't you tell me what I'm not supposed to say? I'm like, because I don't trust them, and I thought, talk about how crazy it would have been if Kierkegaard was a parent and started seeing all that stuff.
Forcing them to march out to a different drum.
Because he already know up front he wasn't going to let his kid get baptized. And he didn't march because he's like, well, if everyone's a Christian, no one's a Christian.
Yeah.
And they just baptize everyone and give them a citizenship card at the same time.
It's, again, he's not saying, I'm not trying to make Christianity palatable. I'm trying to say, if you do this, you will be seriously out of step with common sense. The sense that we all share in common. That is one of the main things Christianity does. And for Kierkegaard, he was like, but tough shit, it's true.
Yeah.
So, being out of step with common sense is actually the only way to truth. But those two things are not the same, And
well, so maybe say a bit about that transition that he kind of describes between the kind of more aesthetic stage to the legal to, the religious. And personally, I like the difference between religiousness A and B as being really helpful for if you're thinking Christian, right?
Yeah.
The difference between religiousness A and B in Kierkegaard helps you get at what he's talking about.
Right.
But when it goes to that story of becoming a person itself, like the transition points as he kind of describes it, and he's describing it internally, like trying to occupy this space.
He's kind of going through it himself.
So anyway,
well, I mean, there's the different stages, the stages on life's way. There's the kind of ethical stage there's the aesthetic stage where it's kind of hedonism. It's all about looking good, feeling good, being able to explain yourself well to other people in a way that they will also agree with you.
The rotation of pleasures and vices.
Right.
So you don't get bored.
And that's one type of person you find in Christendom, and then remember, Christendom doesn't mean Christian. It means Christianized culture.
And they also make for the best reality TV shows.
So, a lot of hedonism in reality TV shows, a lot of ethics.
But I imagine Kierkegaard would say not as much hedonism as the people that enjoy watching them.
Right.
Like you would go, at least they're doing it.
Well, and then maybe you get the next lot. Maybe some of us who watch those shows, we then like to judge.
Oh, yeah.
So now we're entering the ethical stage. And the ethical stage, they say, no, the point of life, or the ethical type of people say the point of life isn't to just live a well-integrated, aesthetically pleasing existence of hedonism. There is such a thing as right and wrong, and there is hard work and toil and labor and meaning and purpose, and your purpose is in being ethical.
Mm-hmm.
But in Kierkegaard's scheme, the ethical is still not Christian. I mean, it might call itself Christian, but it's very much associating hard work and it's Protestant work ethic, and it's free market capitalism, it's whatever. You get out of a system what you put into it, and this kind of thing. It's the rules of common sense.
And that's why the judge, like Judge Williams, like this good example, because he can't differentiate
characters named Judge William.
He can't differentiate the voice of him as a judge from the voice of him as giving ethical advice, to religious advice, to spiritual advice, to family advice. It's Judge William.
It's just you're able to,
and he's Judge William when he's a follower of Christ.
Right, and then you get the religious kind of stage, which is somebody who's starting to. So if you read Fear and Trembling, that's kind of that's in between the ethical and the religious. So the pseudonym Johannes di Silentio, not Kierkegaard, Johannes di Silentio. He's like, I recognize that there is such a thing as right and wrong in society, but I also recognize that that's the social right and wrong is relative. It changes from culture to culture. And just doing what my society thinks is right doesn't mean I'm right with God. So it's always, it's wrong in society's eyes to kill your son. But for Abraham, he was being asked to kill his son. So there was a wedge between common sense morality and what God was asking him to do.
And you say to yourself, that is by far the most offensive story you could have used for that.
Yeah.
If he was just like, you know what? A good example for this is, remember those times where God's like, just kill all the women and children too? Right. You could have wrote the book and been like that, but that just fits the whole moral progress narrative.
I would like to point out, so that's religiousness A, which is very Gaudian. Now, Gaudians, that religiousness A people, they worship God.
Oh, God's everywhere and nowhere.
Guess who doesn't get much of a look in religiousness A? Jesus Christ. When you get through the system, so Di Silentio, he's not a Christian. He even tells you I'm not a Christian. He says, I'm not a Christian, but I think it looks like this. And he tells the story of Abraham. Jesus doesn't get mentioned once. Kierkegaard is doing this on purpose. He does not want you to think that fear and trembling is the last and best word on Christian faith. The author tells you, I'm not a Christian. And he gets it wrong. And you have to keep reading through the books. And eventually, Jesus starts showing up all over the place. When you get the really Christian pseudonyms who say, I am a Christian, and this is what I think it looks like. You get this book called Practicing Christianity, which is the one that inspired Bonhoeffer to write Discipleship. And Jesus all of a sudden is the figure of faith. It's not this voice that you hear in your head telling you to murder your son.
Yeah.
So, in fact, then that's where we're getting to religiousness B in the Kierkegaard scheme, which is this kind of a Christian sense of religion as opposed to a Gaudian sense. Does that make any sense?
No. Because I think
and that's where you get into what he would call authentic Christianity, is that kind of relationship with Christ, which starts to inform all of your other actions. Right?
Because there is that temptation in Christianity to take Christ and then make your understanding or account of the gospel or whatever this naturalized account of religion and spirituality.
Yeah, exactly.
And where then there's this intense divine immanence such that Jesus might be the key in a sense to understanding it as a Christian, but the presence of God, this thing becomes a natural part of the immanent plane.
Well, and this is the root of this strong line, which is actually sort of real Christianity is fiercely critical of religion. This cliche, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. I mean,
which I tend to think people don't know what that means.
They don't know what it means. They just say it. But, this is where it inspired Barth and Bonhoeffer, religionless Christianity and Barth and stuff, like the idea that religion is systematizing. It's dumping into a group or a network or a system what should have been kept as a lively sense in the moment. Right. And so if you can't cultivate the lively sense of being before Jesus in the moment, then you've become religious.
Well,
Christianity
if you think
is one
of
prime enemies of religion.
He has this critique of Hegel.
Yeah.
Right. So, and Hegel gives these lectures on the philosophy of religion when he tells like the whole story of religion and system and how it fits in a thing. And I feel like I have I think sometimes he overreads Hegel and things, but I always think like if you put Kierkegaard and Hegel and Nietzsche in a room and then you just overheard the arguments for a long time, a lot of like the real ugly expressions of a lot of things are no longer left.
Okay.
And that kind of battle of ideas in the 19th century seems like a purifying fire you should have to go through. Like, and like the critique and genealogy of morals is for sure strikingly similar to his critique of this kind of
Nietzsche's Antichrist is really similar to Jesus's. I mean, Nietzsche gets Jesus,
and that's why
he just doesn't like him.
Yeah, and then the like Hegel gets a lot of what happens on the cross in intensely. He goes to poetics around the cross in a number of places that he then tries to fit it in a system, but the number of theologians of the cross that go back to like these Hegelian accounts of the cross and recognizing not just the incarnation, but this negation that happens in the cross. They're very powerful moments. Mostly the second class I want to teach is Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche.
Okay.
And just so I could read them all together. And and it's but there's, when Christianity's any expression of it gets so Christologically decentered.
Yeah.
I feel like Kierkegaard is like the appropriate enema.
Well, this is where he's okay. Okay, you can say enema. I was going to say salt to the steak,
or salt to the steak.
But yeah, enema for sure. Why not? I'm a gadfly, and he at the in Attack on Christendom kind of stuff. The last years of his life, he says, "I'm the fireman. I'm the guy ringing the bell, going through the town, saying there's a fire. I'm not putting out the fire. I'm just telling you there is one. It's for other people to put it out." But there is a kind of a sense of like, well, where are we for time? Because this leads quite well to my last.
Go for it.
Actually. So Kierkegaard will help you become a person, but he will help you become a better person.
Mm-hmm.
This is why you should go with Kierkegaard. Because for one thing, the whole of life is in him. So the gamut of emotions are in Kierkegaard. If you read Kierkegaard, you'll find puppy love, worship, humor. There's more. Listen, I have three degrees, graduate degrees in theology and philosophy, and I can tell you there's more genuine laughs in Kierkegaard than in anybody else. He really can be funny. He's made me cry. He's
if you
honest,
don't cry when you read the Milkmaid
right.
section in a fragment,
there is the whole of life in this guy, and he's not a philosopher. He's trying to help. He's trying to get you to become a human being. He's not trying to convert you even to a system of thought.
Which is odd, because that's not too far from what Socrates thought he was doing.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Like, love Socrates, yeah.
In one sense, you have this critique of Socrates.
Yeah.
In another sense, that's the archetype of his vocation.
For sure.
Because, he just figured out, now that people have pamphlets and magazines and literature becomes a place versus public rhetoric.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he does to Denmark what Socrates did.
Yeah.
And the way, and I thought it seemed more similar the way you tell the politics of his funeral.
Yeah.
If you're in a class where you're just reading texts with a bunch of philosophers, you miss how connected those texts are to his life.
Yeah.
And if you were thinking of the whole story of Socrates' death and the politics of it, and it's like, it's political, and then they're also letting this theater go on, and he's talking to his students, and then what is Kierkegaard's funeral? But students and the state and religion, and
one of the
reasons people didn't like
Kierkegaard is they said he's corrupting the minds of the young, and he's leading them away from Christianity. And that's what Socrates was being accused of, leading people away from the common religion, corrupting the minds of the young. Then he was forced to kind of kill himself. And Soren was having a very similar thing was happening to him. And he was aware of that. He was extremely well read and he was aware of what was going on. And he didn't seek it out. But when it was starting to happen to him, he's like, okay, I know what's happening here now. And it became part of his writing. So if you read him, he'll kind of introduce you to that, and he'll help you give a language to some of these things that we all experience. And he's somebody who really, he's one of the genius of introspection. I mean, he's one of the first writers who really paid attention to the inner life in a really full way. In fact, one of the reasons we kind of even have a rich language of the inner life, you can trace back to Kierkegaard. So a lot of psychology and counseling and therapy kind of language often comes to us through people who read Kierkegaard and were influenced by him. A lot of mental health issues are actually people were reading Kierkegaard and were influenced in how to deal with people with mental health. So, I mean, the whole of life is in him. But also, if you're a Christian, but even if you're not a Christian, but I'm going to assume most people watching this probably are, like, take the hit. Iron sharpens iron. He's like, let him offend you, let him punch you in the face and see what happens. Don't try and argue yourself out of it. Let him say, why are you earning your money being a theologian? Why are you teaching your children these morals? Why are you, attending a 4th of July celebration? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Let him offend some of the things that you assume are absolutely right and see what happens. He'll make you a better person, I think, as a result. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the things I think people that preach every week,
right,
or teaching can gain from Kierkegaard is the power of indirect communication.
Yes.
Because how many sermons just, here's what I'm going to tell you, now I'm going to tell you, you're welcome.
Right.
And Kierkegaard doesn't do that.
No.
And he doesn't do it because he takes the listener seriously enough.
Yeah.
That any true communication will involve their subjectivity being caught up in it. And when the way you engage a text, the way you engage worship, the way you engage a friendship, a relationship, or whatever, the greatest gift you give someone is a question and then the space to think about it.
Yeah, right.
And I think too many people will take the conclusions of Kierkegaard and then start using them in the least Soren-like way.
Right. Yeah, that's a temptation I've got.
Oh, yeah, no.
It's really well said, yeah.
No, I mean, I think like in the first chapter of my book, I summarize what he does in 4 books very briefly just to let you know you should agree with him.
Right.
And then you're like, and that's probably not how we would do it. But
exactly. And he's somebody who was quite... It's a discipline that's worth cultivating, I recognize in myself, and I suspect for everyone, where he can live with people who disagree with him. So he gets obsessed. He's a bit of a Rottweiler, like he latches on to something, he doesn't want to let go. But ultimately, kind of at the end of the day, he's like, I'm not trying to convince you of my position. I'm just trying to say as excellently as I can what I need to say, and I'm going to leave it there. And that leaving it there is a lesson I think is worth learning. I mean, it goes a long way to solving some of the tribalistic kind of, factionalism that we have, where we're so trying to convince people to make them join our group or to defeat the other group. We're not very good at just saying, this is what I think as excellently as I can. Here we go. I'm going to leave it. And I'm learning that from Soren, actually, how to try and do that as well. And to, like you said, leave that space for those people, because ultimately it's not me and you who's going to convince somebody. It's the Holy Spirit. Right.
Yeah.
And so.
Oh no! I mean, he's
very Christian. He's very Christian.
Spent a long time making sure that
Trinitarian. Yeah.
that Lessing's ditch stayed ditchy.
Yeah.
Like you don't need the worst thing Christianity can do is have a good apologist.
Right. And he's very non-apologetic. He's really against
apologetics at the objective level.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you read his accounts of love or some of the parables he tells you, those are apologetic, but they're at the existential register. Yeah. And I think that post Kant and Hegel, so much of sophisticated theology is simply at the metaphysical level. It misses my PhD's in philosophy of religion. I like doing science and metaphysics and all that kind of stuff. And I think there's a completely different conversation between talking about the plausibility or account of a God-world relationship or how you engage science and any of that stuff than how you respond to having been addressed in Christ. Yeah. Like that's an existential level.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, and I don't know if people, at least my theory is the reason I get invited to a church to talk about religion and science is not because there's a very committed atheist in there and a very committed Christian. They're going to walk out different. Yeah. It's because someone has already encountered God in Christ and knows science and wants to go, yeah, how's that work?
They want to figure out how it works. Yeah, you're actually there to encourage and build up, not there to convince. And
the apologetics I'm doing is for people that can't explain the world without it being mediated by Jesus and they're a physicist.
Right.
And so you're like, oh, okay, I'll do this.
Yeah.
And sometimes it might make the conditions for people to trust an experience or something, but and I haven't even figured out the best way of describing it, but I feel like there are different registers, and his emphasis on the existential one helps you realize that you don't want metaphysics or history or any of the other things doing the work that only the human subject can do.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing. So people sort of accuse Soren of being like sort of anti-rational and stuff, and he really isn't. So obviously it's easy to find isolated things where he makes fun of reason or something like that, but he really isn't. But what he's saying is reason is great for all sorts of things. It's just not very good for is Jesus God? And reason is, or common sense is great for all sorts of things. It's just not very good for loving your neighbor. He's not sort of saying these things are evil and must be destroyed. He's just saying, put them in their place. What are you expecting your inherited traditions to do the heavy lifting that they can't do? So yeah, for sure. That's the kind of way he's trying to put everything back in its place.
So we have a question.
Okay.
That, one of the most perplexing things I find reading Kierkegaard is figuring out how all those pseudonyms fit together into his thought as a whole.
Yeah.
Or does it make any sense to think of as a whole.
Okay, great.
Because, obviously they should read the first long book and this one. And
So his pseudonyms are, let me start. He had an aim. His aim was to reintroduce Christianity into Christendom. He said that was his aim. And if you take him at face value, you can totally see he's doing that at every stage. He's reintroducing Christianity into Christendom. But he didn't sit down at year zero and think, in 14 years' time, I want to be having an attack on Christendom against the bishop. It wasn't that planned out. But what it was he's going, all right, how do I, at this point right now, how am I going to reintroduce Christianity into Christendom? And he himself is working through things. So there's a lot of his pseudonyms are he's working through stuff himself, which at the time is kind of where he's at, or sometimes it's where he is at, and sometimes it's where he thinks his opponents are at. Sometimes it's where he thinks his readers are at. The pseudonyms kind of they're more like characters in a play who represent different points of view. And so the one guide is you pretty much shouldn't take, or you can't easily take any pseudonym as if it's representative of Kierkegaard's thought, because it's too complicated. He's very deliberately trying not to make that happen. So you shouldn't do it. And he says, don't quote. If I use a pseudonym, don't quote the pseudonym, or don't quote me, quote the pseudonym. So, I always approach the pseudonyms. I read them in relationship to the other ones, because you can kind of start to see the comments going on. You can start to see some themes that continue all the way through, and some themes don't. So the leap of faith, the night of faith, for instance, never gets mentioned again. It gets mentioned once in Fear and Trembling. Never gets mentioned again. So I take that as a clue, like, that doesn't seem to be a core idea to Kierkegaard's thought. It seems to be a thought that he was representing in one pseudonym, who represented this state between ethics and religion. So his pseudonyms have a kind of a conversational, they're dialectical. I mean, he's a dialectical. Barth learned his dialectical theology from Kierkegaard. It's theology, it's truth through conversation. But the conversation happens to be him with himself, and he's having it with these different pseudonyms. And then you have non-pseudonymous works, where he's a little bit more overtly Christian, often. And he tried to have a non-pseudonymous work published at around the same time as a pseudonymous work. So there was always kind of two going on. And sometimes he'd have more than one pseudonymous work published at the same time. So there's this kind of a dance, perichoretic dance of pseudonyms and non-pseudonyms. And it is admittedly complicated. Towards the end of his life, after the Corsair affair where he was being made fun of publicly, things become a lot less complex. He ended this book called The Concluding Unscientific Postscript was what he intended to end the whole pseudonymous conversation. And with that book, he kind of expected his writing to end. But that happened right around the time that he was made fun of publicly. So then he was like, you can almost hear the gears whirring up again, and he has to start writing again to kind of correct what was going on. But the books after the Corsair become much more obviously Christian, much less tied to their pseudonymous obfuscation. And then when you get into the attack on Christendom stuff, which is his own voice, becomes much more kind of, you can see themes that have been leading up to this point for sure. So I tend to start from the back and move backwards with Kierkegaard. I don't recommend you start with the pseudonyms, actually. I recommend you start with, I tend to say, read a book called For Self-Examination, which is I think probably one of his most beautiful books, and also is written under his own name. By this stage, it really was the last book he wrote before he went all attack on Christendom. And when he wants to be clear, he can be. He's a good enough writer. So when he's being complicated, he's usually doing it on purpose. He's trying to make you work hard, or he's making fun of some other theologian of the day. A lot of his books are satire. So the concept of anxiety, there's a lot of good stuff in there, but also it is a satire on other people's writing of the age. So, you have to take that with a grain of salt. But I'd say start with For Self-Examination. It's very clear. It's beautiful. It kind of.
Which book is it that he does like the parody of Hegel's language? Is the
so the concluding unscientific postscript is. I mean, so the book Philosophical Fragments is a thin little book. You know, it has the milkmaid story and it has stuff about the first-hand, second-hand disciples. It's absolutely brilliant. Then comes along the concluding unscientific postscript to the Philosophical Fragments. That book is 600 pages. It's 3 times the length of the, right? The book itself is a joke. The size of the book is part of the joke. That he's called this the postscript, which is 3 times as long as the original. And it's then ordered. If you look at the table of contents, it's ridiculous. There's like paragraph 2A, part C, you know, section 12. And it's really detailed. And a lot of people look at that and they're turned off by it. But what we don't notice is what they would have noticed right away when they opened that up. Like, oh yeah, he's just making fun of Hegel. Or not even Hegel, Hegelians. He's making fun of Danish Hegelians who were trying to emulate Hegel and come up with systematize their thought into neat little patterns. And he's just making fun of them.
Yeah.
So a lot of his books are a joke with serious stuff in them, but he's doing it in a kind of he's got a tongue in his cheek. He got a twinkle in his eye, right? So you gotta approach him with kind of a sense of humor. And when he's really difficult to read, it might be that he wants to be. And it might be that he's laughing even as he writes it.
I think of him a little bit like Tarantino as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Where he has these different types of text he writes. But you know when Tarantino made a movie, because like he's going to have paid weird attention to specific details. He will have repetitious tropes in the language that are really giving his meta.
And you can tell what he's riffing on. You can tell what other movie, like, oh yeah, he's doing, you know, spaghetti westerns here. Oh, he's doing, you know, blaxploitation or whatever. Like you can kind of tell. And if in 200 years time, all we had was Quentin Tarantino movies, we'd miss a lot of the nuance and what was going on around it. We'd miss the conversation he was having with the other stuff. And
you would just think this guy there's a lot of blood in his movies.
Yeah.
And you would say, man, Kierkegaard's he's a bit depressing.
Yeah. And you would miss what he's the context he's in. I mean, it's partly he's a victim of his own success because now Kierkegaard is the only philosophical, theological Danish writer that we have. Yeah. Right? When he was writing, he was one of many, and he was having quite a public conversation with them when he did it. And now we just have him.
So the last question is, if you were sitting at a table with like 10 other Kierkegaard scholars,
right,
and y'all are going to have a good argument that only people that write lots of books on Kierkegaard argue about.
Yeah.
What
is a good question.
What does that sound like? Like what are you going to go?
What are the sticking points?
Yeah.
So one of the sticking points that I touched on is this idea that, one of them is the idea that his pseudonyms speak for him. So there's constantly people kind of having a good old ding dong about that. How much can we take these pseudonyms?
And what does having a good old ding dong mean?
Good old argument.
Okay.
You know, a good old,
I don't want to ruin your street cred.
Another one would be, how Christian is he? So it's a weird thing about Kierkegaard. Here he's a Christian man writing Christian books for a Christian audience within Christendom, a bunch of people who think they're already Christian. And the majority of people reading Kierkegaard today aren't Christian and don't want to be. So it's very odd, I think, as a Christian reader, it's very odd to see the lengths they go to distort. I think they distort. So like, when Kierkegaard talks about God, we can read that as, you know, whatever value we have the highest in or something like that. And they'll kind of distort it. And I think, I don't know why you're reading Kierkegaard. If that's what you need to do, there's other people who can do that for you. But so there's a debate about the Christianness and how Christian you have to be to appreciate Kierkegaard. That's definitely a debate that would come up a lot. And right now, the kind of theological readers are I think, a bit on the back foot. So I've been in a room with 10 Kierkegaardians, right? And a number of conversations start with an apology. Well, I'm a theological reader of Kierkegaard. I'm sorry about that, you know. And I don't think we should apologize for it. I mean, I think that's what he was trying to do. So that's one issue. Another one would be within Christian circles, his ecclesiology. I mean, he really has. My friend Christopher Barnett, who's a theological writer in a Kierkegaard, he described Kierkegaard's ecclesiology as apophatic ecclesiology. You only know it where
it just sounds like a blog title.
You know, it's just for Kierkegaard, it's like the church is only known by abstracting, like he only sees negative.
Mm-hmm.
So the church is whatever it isn't that he can see right now. And so he has got a very low, negligible ecclesiology. So there's a lot of Christian Kierkegaardians are trying to, I'm one of them, who are trying to say, actually, no, there is a sense of rebuilding Christian community in Kierkegaard from the ground up, starting with the neighbor, that kind of thing. Congregations of a church rather than a crowd in a church. But those are some flashpoints for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for hanging out on the internet.
Very good.
And talking about Kierkegaard. And remember, if you are watching the replay, to go share it with your friends. And in the email where you get the replay, if you're watching live, you'll get info about his book. And some of you are going to be getting it mailed to you for signing up. So, yeah.
Thank you for having me. I hope the rest of your listeners got something out of this.
I think so.
Congratulations, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. You just finished a podcast. And for that, here's the thing. I think I want to give you something. I'm doing a giveaway right now. It is the Progressive Youth Ministry Toolkit. That's right. For this month of 2017, February, we're doing a giveaway. It's a toolkit, all sorts of really cool stuff, including a flask hole inside of a Bible, some... And then lots of other things. That was just funny.
Yeah. So it's a Bible. It looks like a Bible. You open it up.
But it holds a flask.
It's cut out for a flask.
Yeah.
I mean, every youth minister needs that.
And a headlamp. And a really sweet journal and pen. And, it's a really cool set. You know what I mean? Jelly bean. And also we're giving away 30 copies of the brand new Homebrewed Christianity Guide to God. So if you want to know everything you need to know about the Almighty, then you should enter the giveaway. You should go to the website, homebrewedchristianity.com. Plus, you should come, if you're a youth minister, to PYM, that's Progressive Youth Ministry, March 8th to 10th. And you can come early for a little theological pregame on the 7th. Even if you're not a youth minister, on the 8th, you can just come to the live podcast. If you want to be in Asheville and see some beautiful trees, or you just live there and you're like, of course I'm going to be there. I live there. Then you should come to the podcast.
No excuses not to be there.
None. Also, if you're going to go to the event, use the code HBC. $50 off. You're welcome. So the other thing I was going to say is it's a secret, and I can't tell you. I know. It's a secret, but soon you'll find out about it. But let's say that you wanted to be among the first to find out about a secret.
How would you do such a thing?
Well, you might text the phrase, "Beer Me Jesus."
What number would you text "Beer Me Jesus" to?
44222.
So all I have to do is text "Beer Me Jesus" to 44222?
Yes.
And then I find out about this secret that you're not allowed to talk about?
Yes.
Boy, that's easy.
I don't know, who do you think might want to know about the secret?
Probably everyone.
Well...
But maybe specifically people who live in certain parts of the country.
Yes. Landlocked areas.
Yes. Flyover country, perhaps.
Oh, they don't like it when you say that.
I said perhaps. Well, Ohio's not really.
Oh, I'm pretty sure it counts.
Well, maybe. The Rust Belt. We're from the Rust Belt. We have our own name.
Oh, my bad. Anyway, if you want to find out about a secret when the secret gets released, then you should check out Beer Me Jesus, because there may be info that arrives in your box before anyone else knows it about said summer plans, and then you'd get the cheapest discount and everything.
Yeah, it's really, there's no reason not to.
Well, I know if you don't like having fun.
Well, that's one, I guess.
You are like, this summer, what I don't want to do, I do not want to nerd out with my geek out with people in landlocked areas. If you're a coaster and you're like, none of that, no basket, don't do it. But if you're like, oh, that'd be awesome, then you'll find out where that could be possible, and you would find out which of my friends with a non-American accent would be there with me doing things.
Yeah. So, Beer Me Jesus.
Plus, they might just want to meet you in person, Nathan.
I mean, who? Yeah.
They said...
I'll be there.
I know. That's what I'm saying. But they are where? We don't even know what it is.
Exactly.
That's why you got to Beer Me Jesus. Yeah. So, that's all we have to say right now. But thanks for listening. And remember, we don't want to think for you. We want to think with you.
Amen.
Amen.
Smoochy booties.